Ever wondered how the survivors of the realm interact outside of the trials? Today we're looking at just that. I've separated the relationships into different sections to discuss one by one. Unlike the killers, the survivors are a little bit different as obviously they're normal people. They don't really have strained relationships the way the killers do. Most of them just sort of get along, so it's a bit easier actually to talk about these relationships, and there's probably a whole lot more, making it maybe a bit overwhelming at times. So I'll do my best to cover as many as I can. Let's get into it. Family is going to kick us off, and yeah, there's actually a number of family members in the realm for survivors, but not quite as many as you'd think, honestly. The first one is between Rick and Michonne, and is our only marriage or couple or husband and wife of the realm. These two are actually married, and were married deep into the apocalypse in the Walking Dead universe, and even have 2 children they raised together. They seem to have a good relationship, and even seek each other out still now in the trials. We then have 2 sibling relationships. We have the Lyras siblings, and we also have Chris and Claire Redfield from the Resident Evil universe. It's nice, all of these relationships are not really strained in any way. They all get along, they're all supportive, and everyone seems pretty happy. It's nice. It's quite nice actually how DbD represents these positive family relationships. The only contested one I had, and one that maybe has a bit of tension, is between Alucard and Soma Cruz, and this one isn't really family, because Soma Cruz, from my understanding, is the reincarnation of Dracula's soul, and Alucard is the son of Dracula, so they sort of have a connection, not really, kind of. I put them in just in case, but I don't know. Moving on. Moving on to friends. This one is interesting, as there's a whole lot of potential for lots of different friendships within the realm and between the survivors. I've sort of separated all the survivors into little groups that I'm going to be talking about. The first one I'm just calling the OGs. This is a group that I think was formed pretty early on, and contains lots of original survivors who I think would have banded together and formed a really strong bond in those early days when no one else was really around and it was mainly just them. A group of mostly teenagers or people in their very early 20s who I think really would have formed a strong bond in that time, in this traumatic period of their lives. So this is Dwight, Meg, Nia, Jake, Claudette, and Fung. Together, I think they would form the OG group, and yeah, I think they'd have a very tight bond, and they'd sort of always remain friends, but also do their best as the OGs to try and welcome any newcomers to the campfire, no matter who they are. I think they would be the sort of the welcoming crew, as much as just a friendship group too. They'd let anyone come join them whenever, they wouldn't sort of push people away, it'd be just a friendly group of people, but they'd still stick pretty tightly together. The next two I wanted to talk about are sort of a duo, and this duo is somewhat canon, I would argue, and this is both Jeff and Kate. And these two seem to be great friends. Based on all the cosmetic collection images we get of them together, they always seem to be hanging out together, and just like chilling in these various realms. It shows them off sort of supposedly exploring the wider realm, which is quite cool. So Jeff and Kate may be an unlikely pairing upon first viewing, but they seem to actually be great friends. And I can imagine this being down to their shared love of art. Jeff is an artist and went to art school, and Kate of course is a musician, so I think that's mainly what bonds them and forms this connection. They're also both quite peaceful souls who want to just help people. I think similar to the OG group, they'd also be trying to welcome people into the trials, and I could see Kate and Jeff possibly even being the leaders of the survivors as a whole, as a wider group. The both of them being very caring and compassionate. I could see basically every survivor connecting with them in some way, and looking up to them in many ways too. The other much more canon friendship we have is between Mikaela Reed and Sable Ward. These two of course were friends in their town of Greenville before the realm, and Sable even directly talks about Mikaela in her lore. There's potentially more going on between them too, but we'll get to that a little bit later. The basis for it though is that they're essentially just good friends. It does seem to be a bit contested. Mikaela doesn't mention Sable in her lore, but Sable mentions Mikaela quite a bit, so there's lots of theories that surround these two, suggesting it could be sort of a one-way friendship, but I don't think this is the case. I think this was just down to Sable essentially retconning Mikaela's lore in many ways. I think the two of them ultimately are good friends, and this is shown off by various things such as their names together on the Greenville statue. The other connection they have, and I think they would make in the realm, is to Arella, specifically through Sable, because Arella was a fan of Sable's and listened to her shows before she came to the realm. I think Arella would fit right in with Mikaela and Sable as a little group, and they'd all get along very well with their love of horror. Arella could tell them both about her haunted house and all the adventures she had, and I'm sure she'd be very interested to hear what happened to Sable, as well as Mikaela. Pretty much all the Greenville crew, in fact, have pretty wild stories to tell. The other canon friendship we have, but a friendship which may be slightly strained nowadays, is between Felix and Elodie. Now, these two were friends back when they were children, and they were part of a group named the Pariahs, who were children of the Imperiati, a group combating the entity and its cult, the Black Veil, seemingly. After both Felix and Elodie's parents were attacked by the entity though, protecting their children, they both went in different paths. For a time, they both strived to find out what happened to their parents, but eventually Felix gave in. He wanted to move on and live a different life. He felt like there was nothing he could do to save his parents, and so he went back and became an architect, something he was always very good at. Elodie, on the other hand, was obsessed with her quest to sort of find out what happened to her parents, and so the Pariahs all sort of became a bit estranged from her. She seems to use her wealth instead to try and find out what happened to them, becoming employed by a man named the Collector and investigating various ancient and dangerous places of the world, retrieving artifacts and finding out more. So by the time of the realm, they've been apart for, I think, over a decade. It's been quite some time. And the lore never really states or never really reconciles how the two of them were doing as friends. It didn't seem like they had talked throughout that entire time they were apart. This means upon finally seeing each other once more in the realm, are they going to be friends? I think it's a really interesting question, and there is a bit of a question mark there. Could Felix resent Elodie? Could Elodie resent Felix? Especially now seeing him in the realm and thinking, oh, if you'd helped me this whole time, maybe we would be in a better spot. Felix may feel the opposite. He may feel like Elodie is somehow responsible for him ending back here. It's not too clear, and it'd be nice, honestly, if we someday got a conversation between the two or some sort of lore entry where we found out more about their relationship. For now, though, it's possible they reconcile and they become great friends again, which is definitely the nicer angle to take. But it's also very possible they sort of hate each other. Okay, now we're going to take a look at some of the license groups. For example, the Resident Evil Crew. This would consist of Leon, Claire, Jill, Chris, Rebecca, as well as Ada, sort of a little bit on the outskirts. Ada could potentially be a survivor that people sort of stay away from, or she alternately keeps a bit of distance. But let's talk about the core of this group first. I think the reason for this group coming together would basically be because they're all from the same universe, and they're all connected in some way or another. Leon knows Claire, Claire is related to Chris, Chris knows Jill, and they also both know Rebecca. So it all sort of connects and works out. They'd all have their shared experiences, and they're all sort of on the same page as well. They all want to protect, and they all want to do the right thing. I think they'd sort of just naturally end up hanging around together. In fact, I think basically all of the licensed characters would generally float toward their groups. They'd generally form from the people from their universe, because, I mean, I think pretty naturally these groups would form due to being from the same universe. Ada is maybe the only contested one of this group, and would have a connection to Leon. And due to Leon being taken before Ada actually betrayed him, it's possible he is a lot more trusting of her. And it's quite possible too that she wants to be part of this group because, well, the realm is a scary place, and while she often puts up this tough facade, I'm sure arriving in the entity's realm might change that pretty quickly. The only person I could see being not so happy with this is potentially Chris, who I believe is aware that she's worked for Wesker in the past. This could definitely create some conflict, but I'm sure it's something they could talk out or potentially even brawl out. The other survivor I sort of wanted to tack on here too was actually Lara. I think Lara would fit in with this group quite well, and maybe even be friends with Jill specifically due to them having their matching clothes. They look really similar though, in terms of what they're wearing at least, I mean. I think Lara would be on a pretty similar page to the RE crew, and I think she'd fit right in. The other group we have is the Stranger Things group, primarily comprised of Steve, Nancy, and Jonathan. Obviously, they're all friends within the show, and do have sort of a love triangle at certain points, but generally are simply friends, and they all get along together. I don't see a reason for this not persisting into the realm. At the points they're taken in the DbD lore, this seems to be a point where, again, they're all pretty happy together, there's no tension between them. The two people I would actually add to this group, and people I think these survivors would get along with, are both Laurie and Quentin. Laurie, I think, could quickly become friends with someone like Nancy, and I think they'd really get along together, both being smart but also very tough. And then I think Quentin would get along pretty well with both Jonathan and Steve. I think a binding experience, in fact, for all of them together is that they've all experienced some weird supernatural things at a very young age, and would be able to relate over these crazy experiences. So I think this group would form as well. The Silent Hill group is maybe a bit of a rough group, made up of Maria, Cheryl, James, Lisa, and Sybil. I could see this definitely being more of a strained group, and having a lot of struggles in general, but I do think all of them would come together still, and would want to support one another regardless, due to them all being from the Silent Hill universe, and wanting to potentially all support each other due to the horrific experiences they've all gone through. I do think, with this said, someone like Cheryl would not be hanging around with them all the time, but I did want to sort of initially put her in here to mention that I think she would still hang around. You know, she'd still want to hear their stories and relate to them, and even try and support them, I think. This seems to be the path she's going on in her DbD lore, is that she's actually sort of trying to become a support system for other people. I could also see Cheryl, though, hanging out with the Stranger Things crew as well. The other little group is, of course, the Alan Wake crew, made up of Alan, Saga, and Rose. These are sort of the same situation, maybe there'd be a bit of strain, but in general I think they'd all get along perfectly fine. The other group we have is the Alien group. I think Ripley and also Rain would naturally come together. Sure, they're not related, and I don't think they know who each other are. The other person I could see joining them is Gabriel, and I think this is purely just down to them all being on the same page, you know, all being from the future, at least from the perspective of all of the other survivors of the realm. I think it would also be sort of a disorienting experience for them, having to talk with all these people who are living essentially in the past for them. It would be a little weird, I think. And so I do think these three would naturally be drawn together. Even though Gabriel is from a different universe, I still think he would be drawn to these two, and they would all sort of get along and relate to one another. I'm sure Gabriel could have a good chat to Ripley about cloning as well and stuff like that. The other group, which is a little bit of a mess, is the Castlevania group. Now, Alucard, Trevor, and Soma, I believe, they're all sort of allies or friends, and so they'd get along fine, I think. That's sort of the core of the group. Then there's a few others I've sort of tacked on, mainly due to the vibe they give off, and the fact that I think they'd sort of get along and understand their world as well. These two would be Geralt, but also Vittorio. I think the two of these would sort of understand the vibe. I don't know, aesthetically, they just all look like they kind of fit together. You know, they got the same sort of style going on. I think they'd all get along. Geralt could talk to Trevor sort of as, you know, two supernatural hunters almost. I think it'd work, basically. They'd all get along, they'd be like a power crew. Alright, now for a few groups I've not really touched on. One little group I think would form would be both Tap and Bill. I could see these two older guys sort of getting together and just being maybe a little bit grumpy, but also sharing their stories. Tap could talk about his crazy days with Saw and investigating him, and Bill could discuss everything that happened to him and the outbreak he went through with the green flu. They both have a desire to protect, but also they're sort of tough externally, but have a softer core, I think. So I think the two of them would get along and could help each other sort of open up And yeah, I think they'd be good friends. The other group I had was Adam, Yuichi, and Jonah. This is sort of like my smart crew. Adam being a teacher, Yuichi being a professor, and Jonah just being a very smart mathematician. I could see these three just being great friends, honestly, and just talking about various things, things that inspire them, that they'd want to share with others, and the other two would listen intently, I think. And I think it'd be, just a nice relationship between the three. I also think Adam in particular, by the way, as he's a teacher, and he seemed to learn a new language fairly quickly, I think he'd do his best to teach lots of other survivors different languages so they could all learn to communicate well. Because in the realm, it's worth noting that obviously a lot of these people come from different parts of the world and different points in time too, and so it's likely they don't speak the same language. So I think having someone like Adam, a great teacher, and someone who seems to pick up language relatively quickly, him and maybe his crew could go around helping to teach people. I think that's pretty cool. There's also the two Bards, Bearmar and Aestri. These two are both friends seemingly, but also went on their long quest to try and defeat Vecna. These two I think would sort of be floaters around the campfire and outside of the trials. They'd sort of go around trying to inspire, talking about their many tales and many stories, many adventures they'd been on, and their final adventure to take down Vecna. They're sort of, be bards, they'd fulfill that role still, just now around the campfire and outside of the trials. This final group isn't really a group. It's made up of Ash, Ace, Nicolas Cage, David King, and Tuberon. I could see them all being protectors around the campfire, all floating between different groups maybe, but sort of all standing guard and watching out for people, floating between various groups for different reasons. I mean, someone like Ace, for example, isn't really going to be the protector type, but I could see him bouncing between various groups. I think this group would sort of float around, but for different reasons. Someone like David would be more protective, he'd want to look out for people, but people like Nicholas would maybe want to just inspire people, talk to them. Ash and Ace would maybe be going around just being a bit silly, annoying, that kind of thing. Yeah. The other group and semi-canonical connection is going to be centered around Jane. Jane knew of Zarina before the trials, and actually talks to her mother on her talk show. I think they'd instantly form a connection, also being on the same page about a lot of things, using their power for a moral purpose. Yui, I think, would quickly join up with this group too, doing a very similar thing as well, using her winnings as a motorbike racer to support other women. The three of them would form a pretty close bond. The other two I could see joining up with this group are both Talita and Renato. I could see them merging in pretty well. Finally, we have our two stragglers that I've not mentioned so far, these being Taurie and Yun-Jin. And these are two who I think would sort of stay on the outskirts and stay away from the group in general. Yun-Jin is the more debatable one here, because while she is all about self-preservation, it's also very possible she softens up a bit in the realm and she does still interact with the groups and try and communicate with the others. I think that's really plausible, honestly. I think it's also possible she does this sort of superficially, if that makes sense. So while she does do this and while she does have connections, they're all pretty superficial, so really she's on the outside. Let me know what you think. In Taurie's case, it's a lot more cut and dry. At the end of the day, she's literally a cultist. Even whilst now in the realm and surviving the trials, she's still praying or begging the entity to try and make her a killer. She still wants to not be a sacrifice, but instead be the hunter. And the survivors around the campfire probably see this and probably see her talking about this and are not all too happy. Taurie doesn't want to be on this side, and no one probably wants Taurie here either, based on the stuff she's saying. And so, yeah, I think it'd be tough to relate to her. I think a few people still would try, people like Jeff and Kate, maybe someone like Yui, probably the OG group too. But I think it'd be very tough, especially for now. Okay, so that's sort of the main separate groups I have. Obviously, all of these people could reasonably interact. These are just the sort of the groups I think they'd go back to over time. Because I think honestly, everyone would probably mingle at some point and everyone would try and talk to one another. They wouldn't stay set in these groups is what I'm trying to say. This is just maybe a vague idea of the kind of groups they would fit into. Moving on to the romantic relationships of the realm, we actually have a lot more canon ones on the Survivor side, and a number of ones that are sort of suggested but are slightly unclear. The first one, of course, is our married couple, Rick and Michonne. These two are married, and so it's obviously a romantic relationship there. The two of them seem to have a great love for one another, and even after Rick's disappearance, Michonne still went out and looked for him. And Rick did the same, trying all he could to return home after all those years. The other romantic sort of triangle we have is between Leon, Claire, and Ada. Leon sort of has a romantic spark with both Claire, but also Ada. He shares a kiss with Ada during RE2, but then he also ends up marrying Claire later in the RE timeline. So this is a bit of an awkward situation maybe. I think ultimately though the healthier relationship here is probably Leon and Claire, so maybe that's the better one to go with. The other canon ones we have are Nancy and Jonathan. Of course at the point they're taken, Nancy and Jonathan are currently together and are boyfriend and girlfriend. I've paired up James and Maria too, even though obviously they have a very interesting relationship, with Maria a bit like not too dissimilar from someone like Pyramid Head, being another manifestation of James's guilt for killing his wife, essentially, but also for the desire he feels. So I paired these two up, although, you know, it's a pretty questionable one, I would say. So now we go sort of into headcanons, and I'm gonna note mainly just popular headcanons here, or popular theorized relationships. So the first one is between Mikaela and Sable, and this is the one I'd say actually has the most grounds to it, mainly due to Mikaela and Sable being so close for one, but also the Mikaela plus Sable on the Greenville statue. This seems quite plausible as sort of a romantic thing, and typically something that romantic partners will do with one another. They could also just be great friends too though, and I think that's also really nice. I think this one is sort of just how you want to see it. I think either way though is perfectly valid. The other one is Chris and Jill. This is just a heavily theorized one. I don't think this ever ends up officially happening, and they seem to just again be really close partners in the games, and just yeah, they're sort of just partners in that sense. But this is a pretty heavily theorized one, so I thought I'd mention that too. The final one is Dwight and David. This seems to be maybe the most popular ship among the fandom, and one that gets mentioned a lot is the two of them. So again, I think it's perfectly plausible. I think survivor shipping in general is a lot easier to do than killer shipping, because, I don't know, it's just a much more straightforward relationship at the end of the day, isn't it? So I think there could be a lot more survivor romantic relationships outside of the trials, I think. It may even be encouraged by the entity, considering that of course it's going to create a lot more emotion if the survivors are much more sort of involved with one another. So in this case I think it's actually very plausible. So if you want to drop any headcanons below too, feel free to. It's not something I'm personally too into doing, but yeah, I think in this case it's yeah, I'm not so against it compared to the killer shipping, I suppose. The final one we have is enemies, and I've sort of touched on this already, as I've already mentioned that I think like Taurie, for example, is sort of just a natural enemy of the wider group because she's literally in a cult and she tried to murder someone, and also she's praying to the entity to go join the other side, the side that is killing them. So I think people generally wouldn't like Taurie, but someone who specifically and canonically doesn't like Taurie is Haddie, because Taurie was actually tasked to go and kill Haddie's brother. And sure, while she didn't go through with it, and she didn't actually end up killing Jordan, she still was planning to, and she regretted it upon coming to the realm. So this is going to be a very strained relationship indeed. Haddie had a lot of run-ins with the Black Veil, or the Black Talon, and so I think this is going to be a very strained relationship. These two are really going to hate each other. The other one I mentioned before, of course, was Ada and Chris. I think these two do have a canonical sort of hatred for one another. Chris sort of hates Ada because she's deceptive, she often changes sides, and of course she's worked with Wesker in the past, who Chris hates. And so I think he'd have a natural distrust for her. At least from what I remember from playing Resident Evil 5, he seems to really hate Ada, from what I remember. other than that, I don't think there's any standout reason for any of the survivors to really hate each other. I mean, hate's a very strong word. And again, they're all sort of regular people, and there's no reason why I think they all couldn't just get along. There'd maybe be some disputes now and then, but I think there wouldn't be any enemies. At least not to the extent of Taurie or Ada in this case. Maybe there could be some disputes with some of the more selfish characters like Yun-Jin, with people complaining they were left behind in the trials or something like that. You know, things like that I think are possible, but I don't know about enemies. I think that's maybe going a bit too far. Alright, so I think that's gonna just about do it. This of course is a video where there's honestly so much potential, so many possibilities for connections here, due to the survivors being so open to that basically, because they're, you know, regular people compared to the killers. So I do see that this is obviously a bit of a tricky one. It's a bit of a loaded question, but I do hope this was fun to watch regardless. And be sure to share all of your thoughts too as well on who you think would get along and who would be friends. I'd be really interested to hear. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.